If you want to hear all of the podcasts and audio reports that we're going to be producing at Dropsite News, you can subscribe to our podcast feed wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Dropsite News. You can also listen at dropsitenews.com. That's dropsitenews.com. This is Intercepted. From Dropsite News, I'm Jeremy Scahill, and this is a special joint episode of Intercepted and Deconstructed. On today's program, I'm going to be joined by several of my colleagues from Dropsite News, Ryan Grimm, Murtaza Hussain, Nausicaa Renner, and Sharif Abdel Kouddous. But before I bring my colleagues in, I want to say a few words about what we are witnessing unfold right now in the Middle East, specifically in Lebanon and Gaza. We are coming up on the one-year anniversary of the October 7th attacks and the launch of Israel's genocidal war against the Palestinians of Gaza. By conservative measures, some 41,000 Palestinians have been killed. That is almost certainly an undercount. Tens of thousands of other Palestinians have been wounded. Almost the entire population of the Gaza Strip has been displaced and forced into a horrifying dystopian game by the Israeli military onslaught to fight for their very lives. And as the fires in Gaza continue to burn, as people continue to be mercilessly targeted, hunted down, killed by the Israeli forces, often with U.S. weapons, we now are witnessing the Israeli government laying siege to areas throughout Lebanon. Yes, there has been rocket attacks from Lebanon. Lebanon said that Hezbollah said it was opening a front in solidarity with the Palestinian resistance soon after the October 7th attacks. And since then, you have seen regular strikes by Israel into Lebanon, Hezbollah firing rockets, but now things have taken a very dramatic and dangerous turn because the Israelis are now engaged in some parts of Lebanon in what I think could accurately be described as a scorched earth bombing. It started in the south of Lebanon, it extended into the east. The Israelis say that what they're doing is trying to degrade Hezbollah's rocket operations, but when you look at just the first 24 hours of these attacks that started on Monday, we had a death count of around 500 people in Lebanon. 50 of those people were children. The Israelis have also struck Beirut a number of times, and the Biden administration has stood by, has said, well, we have some tactical disagreements, but continues to provide arms and political support and to frame everything that Israel does as an act of self-defense. This is an incendiary moment, and at Dropsite News, we have been covering all aspects of it. We've had reporters covering the siege in the West Bank, with Israeli forces intensifying their attacks. We've gotten reporting from the ground inside of Gaza as well, and we're going to continue to do that reporting. And I want to open this conversation up now to my colleagues who have been working on these stories with me at Dropsite News. I'm going to begin with my fellow co-host of Intercepted, Murtaza Hussain. Maz, lay out how you see this moment and where things stand.
Thanks, Jeremy. So I think since the beginning of the war last October, the fear has been that it will expand to a regional war. And ostensibly, all this U.S. diplomatic effort had been expended to stop that from happening. It seems like either the U.S. has just been doing PR for the Israelis to help foster a line expansion of the war, or their efforts were totally ineffectual, because now, despite many, many months of forewarning, it seems like the war in Lebanon that many feared would come is coming now. It's happened now. We see the expansion of Israeli airstrikes all throughout Lebanon. It's very shocking, over 500 people killed in one single day, according to the Lebanese Health Ministry, of the Israeli attack. And reciprocally, Hezbollah attacks throughout Israel, long-range missiles and so forth. So it seems almost inevitable now that the war it's already expanded to Lebanon. It could expand even further as well, too. It could be the involvement of Iran. It could be greater involvement in Yemen and Iraq. The stability of Jordan and other countries could be called into question. it seems like they've entered a situation where there's no real exit. And the Israeli military effectively is fighting three wars at the moment, or wars on three fronts. They're fighting a war in Gaza, now in Lebanon, and then an escalating war they're fighting against Palestinian groups in the West Bank as well. So Israel is very overextended. It could not by any means maintain this sort of campaign or these simultaneous campaigns without U.S. support, which has still been forthcoming. And if you look at the statements of Israeli military officials, they never really wanted to invade Lebanon because they've already had several experiences of invading Lebanon in the past, and it always ended up very unhappily for the Israelis. Obviously, in the 80s, they had an occupation or with proxies and so forth as well. In Lebanon, they invaded again in 2006, and they were defeated in that war by Hezbollah. They don't want to do that again, but now they've set such a high bar that they're going to stop all rocket fire from Lebanon without a peace agreement in Gaza. And they're attempting to do that just by punishing Hezbollah with these pager attacks and with airstrikes. But it seems very, very likely this will end up with them invading Lebanon again. And then we'll see a renewal of the occupation and a renewal of the same vicious cycle that the diplomacy was intended to extricate us from. So I think it's very, very unfortunate that we're seeing the bloodshed we're at today, because it could have been avoided with a ceasefire in Gaza, which Netanyahu has been rejecting because of his own coalition. And now that it started the war, I'm not sure where or how it could possibly end. And it could end with a much, much greater expansion than we've already seen.
And Maz, you mentioned the pager attacks, and of course, this is really when things started to ratchet up. Was last week when thousands of pagers exploded simultaneously, and the Israelis have not officially taken responsibility for it, but it seems quite clear that it was an Israeli operation. And what has been said is that these were pagers that were under the control of Hezbollah. But what we know from hospital officials is that a lot of civilians were also wounded, and some were killed, including children, in these pager attacks. And Sharif Abdel Kouddous, you recently came on board at Dropsite News. You've been coordinating a lot of our coverage out of the Middle East, particularly in Palestine. And while I think a lot of attention rightly is being focused on the situation in Lebanon, and this has the potential to pull Iran deeper into this, it also is raising questions about the role of the Biden administration in potentially green lighting these Israeli operations. But while Lebanon has been intensely attacked, it also seems that the Israelis are ratcheting up their incredibly brutal attacks in Gaza. We saw some horrifying images coming out of Gaza while Lebanon was burning. You've reported on the ground in Gaza. You recently did this incredible documentary for Al Jazeera's Fault Line program called The Night Won't End, which everyone should watch, which is about three families trying to survive the genocidal war in Gaza. But Sharif, talk right now about what is happening in Palestine, as much of the media focus is now zeroing in on this escalating situation in Lebanon.
Well, I think that's right. I mean, as we're coming up on a year of this genocidal assault on Palestine, on Gaza, it's difficult for anything to stand out anymore. As you mentioned, we've seen these horrific attacks, and many people can't really keep up with the atrocities that happen almost on a daily basis. There was a particularly vicious attack on a school several days ago that killed about 24 people. Really horrific images of children just blown apart, and it hardly hit the news at all. These kinds of attacks we should get breaking news alerts all the time. And what we're seeing now actually is the use of these tactics in Lebanon. We're seeing carpet bombing, essentially, that's happening in Lebanon. The Associated Press analyzed satellite data of the area in southern Lebanon that was subject to these missile attacks. And it was an area covering 650 square miles. And you hear stories. There's tens of thousands of people being displaced that are fleeing southern Lebanon. They're driving on roads that are blocked. Bridges have been hit. Roads have been hit. They're driving as missile strikes are falling around them. People are seeking shelter in schools. There's even a report by Agence France Presse that some 500 people crossed into Syria seeking safety. And I don't think there's a level of understanding of this kind of terror, and this is terror, because when we're talking about the pager attacks as well, this is 3,000 small bombs going off on electronic devices. The British Palestinian reconstructive surgeon who flew in just a couple of days after the attack to help with healthcare there, Ghassan Abu Sitta, he said this is the largest act of mass mutilation that we've seen, even more than in the civil war in Sierra Leone. There's hundreds, if not thousands, of people with injuries to their eyes, to their hands. I have friends who have remained at home, who unplugged all their electronic devices. And we're seeing also, I think, what's important to remember is that there is a clearing of space, of physical land around Israel, as it is a settler colonial state. It is clearing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions in Gaza away from their land. And it's also now clearing Lebanon and creating buffer zones around this state. And that's the only way that it can exist as a colonial power. And this kind of violence is not being reported on in the media in this country in the way that it should. There's a lot of marveling at Israel's attacks, at the use of these pagers, at the use of this technology, and very little given to the human cost of this kind of violence.
Ryan Grimm?
One thing I'm curious about is where this goes, because talking to Maz earlier, he was saying, the bombing campaign, can't go on forever. Like the air war can't last indefinitely. At the same time, that's what a lot of us thought in, say, November of 2023 about the assault on Gaza. Like, surely this can't go on forever. You even had, Jake Sullivan telling Netanyahu's cabinet, you're out of credit. Like, you have to wrap this up by the end of December. Like, this has to end. And while we might not have believed Jake Sullivan that they were going to wrap it up exactly by the end of December, I think even if you would have asked any of us if they'd still be pummeling Gaza in September of 2024, we would say maybe with some one-off attacks as they've done for years, but not the full-on assault that has basically never waned. And so I'm wondering, does Israel need to reoccupy southern Lebanon, or can they just launch a forever air war? No other country could do that, but one that is getting effectively free shipments of weapons from a major superpower endlessly has that option on the table. Or am I missing something, that there's a reason that they can't just do a years-long bombing campaign?
Well, it would certainly require the U.S. to maintain the status quo. But another aspect of this that we've reported on at Dropsite News also is the question of is Hezbollah actually engaging in as robust of a response to Israel as it's capable of? And I think everyone that really knows Hezbollah, has studied it, has connections and an ability to talk to people from within the group is saying no, that actually Hezbollah is still engaged in a fairly reserved posture against the Israelis. And there's been a lot of discussion of Hamas's tunnels under Gaza. Hezbollah has a far more extensive tunnel network, particularly in the south of Lebanon. They have far more advanced weaponry. They have a much larger supply of rockets, by some estimates between 150 to 200,000 rockets and other projectiles, tens of thousands of fighters who, by many measures, are functioning more in a conventional manner than, for instance, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. So there is a question of what it actually will look like if Hezbollah decides to start using some of its more advanced weaponry. If Iran decides that it's going to become more actively involved in the defense of Lebanon, these are all factors that I think we're going to see play out. But directly to your question, Ryan, I think part of what we're seeing Hezbollah do is test the Iron Dome system. You're seeing these barrages of rockets. Maz the other day was making the point that if Hezbollah, for instance, wants to strike the port of Haifa, or if they attack Ben Gurion Airport, that would be an indication that Hezbollah is now deciding to cross a line of sorts that they haven't to date, where they are trying to perhaps enact a mass civilian casualty incident inside of Israel. Earlier this week, there was a piece in the Times of Israel talking about how the injuries thus far in this acute moment where Israel is bombing Lebanon and Hezbollah is responding, that most of the injuries that Israelis have suffered as a result of the first 2 days of this response from Hezbollah have been injuries on their way rushing to try to go into a shelter, in addition to psychological issues. The calculus of all of this could change if Hezbollah does strike at civilians the way that Israel has enacted large civilian death episodes. I wanted to also bring in Nausicaa and ask her. Nausicaa is the founding editor of Dropsite News and has been really responsible for sort of anchoring all of our coverage. And just to give people a sense of behind the scenes, sometimes we get up and we think we're going to be doing a certain story, and we end up all just kind of crashing on a story together and trying to handle fast-moving events. That's what happened the day that the pager bombs went off. But Nausicaa, maybe your thoughts about where we stand right now, and also the strategy that's evolving at how to cover the news at Dropsite.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, thank you, Jeremy. I'm sitting here listening, and my job is to kind of listen and reflect and process, and I'm just reflecting on how completely foolish the U.S. has been since the very beginning. I mean, I think as an observer from the outside, there was a calculus in the early days of the war that there was not going to be an effort to rein in Israel immediately on the part of the U.S. And there should have been the lesson that we learned in Ukraine, that, a ceasefire is easier the earlier you do it. The longer you let a war go on, the more anger proliferates, and the more dangerous it is for everybody involved. And the expansion of the war into Lebanon, in my view, is it represents the stalemate that is going on in Gaza. Not stalemate in the sense that there are no bombs landing there. There absolutely are, but the diplomatic point of blockage that they've gotten to. In terms of how to cover it, I mean, I think we're very lucky at Dropsite to have reporters who are incredibly agile and intelligent, and working with people on the ground to kind of bring out the views that you're not going to see elsewhere. But we're really trying to move fast and move in response to the news.
Ryan, or whoever wants to take this. I mean, there is this issue of the Biden administration for many, many months. I mean, we had all these cycles we went through, and this is picking up on Nausicaa's point about the ceasefire. I think it's really, really clear that the main party that has prevented any agreement or ceasefire has been Netanyahu. I mean, his own people even say that. And we've talked to sources who are involved with the mediation effort, with the negotiations over a ceasefire, that have been very clear, and Hamas says this publicly, that Hamas agreed to what was being referred to as the Biden framework, which Biden himself said was actually the Israeli plan. But you now have a lame duck president in Joe Biden, who throughout the entire duration of his 50 or so years in politics has been, in his own words, a very committed, passionate Zionist, who has repeatedly defended Israel when it's at its most brutal and its most violent throughout his political career. He now is in the waning days of his one-term presidency, and it seems, Ryan, like Biden has sort of made the decision to let the Israelis burn it right now. I mean, it is clear he could stop it if he wanted to, but he's not.
If he's still making decisions, then that does seem to be the decision that he made. It does represent this really remarkable and unusual situation in which the Biden administration really did do some things publicly intended to pressure Israel into ending the war. And in particular, the thing that they did the most was this move that was kind of reminiscent of when it was like RFK Sr., during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviets had made an offer and then they withdrew it and put out a new offer to end the crisis. And RFK said, just go take that initial offer and go on TV and say, we've accepted the Soviets' offer and it's over. And the Soviets were kind of caught flat-footed, and they're like, oh, well, I guess it's over. They accepted our offer. And Biden did a version of that where he took the kind of fake proposal that Netanyahu had allowed go through his war cabinet, but really didn't support. But it had gone through the proper processes and had gotten to the mediators. And so Biden made that plan public in a speech and said, here is the Israeli plan. I thank them for their willingness to compromise here. It's a good plan. It's now up to Hamas, to accept this plan. Hamas then goes and accepts the plan, and that's kind of how you would see this ending. Then you'd be writing about what a clever move Biden had made. Historians would look back and say how sharp that was to go and reach into the bag of tricks there. Instead, Netanyahu said, no, we don't support that anymore. And I forget which particular atrocity he carried out at that time. I know that the attack on Hania was around then as well in Tehran, but there were some other major ramping up the atrocity to 12 types of attacks, and Netanyahu then successfully derailed it. So what I'm saying, the reason I say it's unusual is that it showed that the U.S. did want to get a ceasefire, and the Democrats did feel like a ceasefire at that moment was in their political interests. They also have the power to make it happen. Okay, that little trick didn't work, but that's not the only trick that the most powerful country in the history of the world has. Anybody listening to this can think of plenty of things that they could do to bring this to a close, and yet chose not to. Not because they don't know the levers that they can pull. They chose not to pull them, and instead said, well, I guess we're just going to see how this plays out. And we're seeing that now. So it's, at this point, the U.S. is a completely willing and complicit, 100% supporter and enabler of what's going on, rather than somebody who is just unfortunately unable to do anything to stop it.
No, I mean, to your point, Ryan, it's not even a trick that it needs. As you mentioned, Israel could not prosecute this genocidal assault without constant replenishment of arms. It would have to make very hard choices if it was running out of these munitions. It has shown that it has actually a meager fighting force on the ground when it actually engages with Hamas, who are very poorly equipped. They keep going into areas only after they're completely razed and bombed, and yet they still suffer casualties. And when they leave the area, fighters return. So they need these weapons. And it's very, very easy for the United States to cut off weapons shipments. Biden did it once with one form of bombs, the 2,000-pound bombs. It caused a furor. But they can very easily cut it off, and that would force a decision. We saw in 2021, Biden told Netanyahu, and there was a lot of coverage of children being killed in Gaza, and he said, you're out of runway. Stop it. And it ended. And so this is not about tricks or political maneuvering or trying to force a negotiation between two parties. This is needing to make a decision, a political decision domestically, that they need to stop arming and replenishing the supplies of Israel so that it has to stop. It can't continue this kind of assault on now two fronts without this constant free weaponry that it keeps getting.
Yeah, it feels like, I was curious for your take on this, the only way that the Biden administration really wanted the war to come to a close or to come to a ceasefire was if Israel kind of did it on its own without any serious pressure from the United States. And why would that be? Where does that posture come from? Why is the United States so afraid of using pressure? And it's not even pressure, it's just not sending the next shipment and making a phone call and saying you're out of runway. It's that simple.
It's really baffling on its face because obviously the continued prosecution of this war, which has no real goals at this point, is not in American interest. It's a drain on American resources. There's U.S. carrier groups which have been redeployed from the South China Sea to the Middle East, as the time the U.S. is theoretically trying to pivot away. In every way, this is draining America's political, diplomatic, and other resources. But I think it's what Sharif alluded to when they tried to withhold one form of bomb, for a temporary period. There was this very concocted backlash, and it seemed to chasten them, and caused fear in the administration of some other sort of internal clash in the U.S. over the subject of Israel, which is such a irrational red line in American politics. But also, I think that Biden and Blinken are very ideological. I think they're ideological and they're comfortable ideologically with what's happening as well, too. So they're continuing to not just arm Israel, but also replenish its Iron Dome batteries, which are very, very expensive to run, and the U.S. taxpayer basically runs them. The deployments of all these troops in the Mediterranean and the Persian Gulf region to protect Israel from possible backlash from Hezbollah and from Iran and any other party which may attack it. So it's a huge drain on American resources, and there's no ability to even, have a measured sort of restraint on Israel. It's complete no holds barred enabling of Israel and a very particularly extreme Israeli government. So I think that, in the short term, maybe it's serving Israel's purposes to do that, or at least people are there convinced it's doing so. But I don't think it's very helpful to become so extremely dependent only on one country, one distant country, being so dependent for your own sovereignty on the support of a continued support of superpower, being on worse and worse terms with all your neighbors, with whom you will not make any compromises or political agreements, even when many of them are on the table at the moment. So I think that it's kind of it's enabling the very, very worst tendencies in Israeli politics. And if you look at the map of Israel, it's a very difficult to defend strategic region because it's basically an island. It has no ground trade or ties with the surrounding countries. It relies on the port of Haifa, the port of Eilat, and then the Ben Gurion airport. The port of Eilat has been almost shut down by the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea over the past year. Haifa is very close to Hezbollah attacks. Ben Gurion is also susceptible to Hezbollah attacks. If those were to be shut down, then it'd be an island without any resupply happening. So I think from an Israeli perspective, ramping up aggression and ramping up bellicosity and refusing to compromise, maybe it's giving a short-term sort of political benefit to Netanyahu. It's increasing the level of sense of siege and rallying around the flag. But I think it's very dangerous. And I think it's very dangerous because the U.S., Biden is not always going to be around. Maybe decades from now or shorter time from now, the U.S. may not be able to provide the same level of overwhelming support it's doing today. And if Israel needs that level of overwhelming support to survive and sustain itself, it's very, very dangerous.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to back up and remember that when the last time that Israel and Hezbollah fought a war was 2006, and the Israelis invaded. And I think universally people understand that Hezbollah, on a tactical level, won that war and forced Israel into a ceasefire, and it created, it really elevated the status of Hezbollah in the region. But what didn't exist in 2006, but does exist today, and Maz sort of alluded to part of this, is you have what is called the axis of resistance that has emerged. And, if you read corporate media and a lot of journalism in general, people will often make it seem as though Hezbollah and Hamas or Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, that they're proxies of Iran. But actually, the more that we watch events unfold, I think it's a mistake. It's an oversimplification. Maz and I have talked about this before. Amal Saad's work is very good on this. Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas, the Islamic resistance in Iraq, some of the smaller armed Palestinian armed factions, as well as the Houthis in Yemen, all constitute the axis of resistance. These are countries that have agreed to coordinate actions that are aimed at confronting Israel, including militarily. And we've seen perhaps the most aggressive other members that are not the Palestinians or Hezbollah that have gone after Israel is in fact Ansar Allah in Yemen. Not just the blockade in the Red Sea, but also, remember, they managed to launch an attack all the way from Yemen into Israel. That was of tremendous symbolic importance to not just the Yemenis, but also, I think, to the region as at large. But I think Iran, has been extraordinarily reserved. I think genuinely Iran does not want a wider war. I think that's really clear. In fact, the new president of Iran, that was his message when he arrived in New York for the UN General Assembly. And you can say, oh, well, the Iranians will say this. Their actions are indicating it. Look what happened when earlier this year, the Israelis bomb the Iranian consulate in Syria. They kill a number of Iranian officials, including people from the Revolutionary Guard. The Iranians responded to that by basically telling the United States and Israel what they were going to do. And then they launched this large missile and drone attack on Israel. But they did it in such a way that the Israelis, the Americans, had time to make sure that they were going to be able to counter every single munition that was fired at Israel at that time. And you also had Jordan, for instance, played a major role in that operation. It allowed the Biden administration to sort of say, we put together this coalition of willing, even Arab states participated in the defense of Israel. Ismail Haniyeh, the political leader of Hamas, who was not a military figure, he was the political head. He also was the former democratically elected basic head of state of Palestine. When Hamas won the elections, they didn't just win the elections in 2006 in Gaza. They won them throughout Palestinian territories, and Haniyeh even briefly was the actual man in charge of that government. And of course, that was dismantled, and then, the rest is his history, as they say. But Haniyeh goes to Iran. He then goes back for the night to sleep in a guest house in Tehran that was under the protection of the most elite Iranian military force, the IRGC. And in the wee hours of the night, he gets assassinated. And there's a dispute as to how he was assassinated. We spoke to actually a witness to those events, another Hamas official who was 2 flights below Ismail Haniyeh. This was surreal. The day after Haniyeh's assassination, I spoke to Hamas's senior representative in Iran, and he was in the building himself. He said it was like an earthquake had hit. He runs up and he describes seeing like a gaping hole in the wall as though a projectile had been fired at it. Israeli press promoted the idea that the Mossad had infiltrated the facility, that they had infiltrated the IRGC, and they planted a bomb under the bed. However, he was killed in a compound controlled by the IRGC, and Iran has not yet responded to that. And, I think some people say, aha, they're scared, etc. I think Iran is really weighing what's happening here. And, a big story in the Arabic language press is that doesn't get talked about much in the American media, is that a lot of analysts believe that Israel is setting in motion its own demise through its actions right now. So it's possible that the Iranians are calculating that while what Israel is doing right now is a horrifying crime against humanity and a mass murder operation, that in the long arc of history, what Netanyahu is doing is the beginning of the end of the state of Israel. I think it's possible that's part of the calculus at play. I'd be very curious if Maaz agrees with me or not, but I think that's part of what the thinking is here. The Taliban used to say, we've got the time and you've got the clocks. And I think to a degree that also is the mentality of powerful forces in Iran.
This was always the ideology underpinning anti-colonial wars, where that they just felt that as long as you survive, eventually the colonials will go home. So in Vietnam and many other theaters, they very much had this idea, and the Afghans, of course, too, in the 80s and again when the U.S. came. So I do think that the Iranians are animated by that belief that as long as they can survive and have strategic patience and make things difficult for the Israelis, they'll depart the region and go back to where they think they came from. I don't know if that really applies in this circumstance because, Israelis, most of them don't have citizenship from another country. It's not the same thing as the Pied Noirs in Algeria, for instance. But I do think they think that way. And I do think that their goal is to make life in Israel uncomfortable, such that it degrades the state over a very long period of time. And then it becomes harder and harder to function. And people who are educated or who have options will choose to leave, and the tax base will eventually erode. I do think they have the idea behind it. I can't speak to whether if it's a realistic idea per se. It's very complicated. But that's the very common and very traditional view of how to fight an anti-colonial war. It's more about survival. I think Henry Kissinger actually said this ironically. He said that for the guerrilla, the goal is just to survive. And if you survive, you won in a confrontation with the enemy. But that's how they see things. So I do think that certainly the situation is harming Israel's position. I think the sad thing is there is an off-ramp. There's been an off-ramp for many, many years. The Arab countries, contrary to how it's described by people in the U.S. who are more vocal supporters of Israel, they've offered agreements with Israel in exchange for the creation of a Palestinian state. They just don't want to do it. They don't want to sacrifice the territory in the West Bank or even at this point, even make any sort of political concessions that recognize Palestinians as political actors, whether they're the PA or the PLO or Hamas or any other. So because of that, they've sort of egged themselves or sort of cornered themselves in a position whereby everyone in the region effectively is their enemy. And even countries like Egypt, which have peace agreements with Israel, the ties have gotten much, much weaker and much more hostile in recent months. And that's a very difficult position to be in if you're a country of only a few million people. You need to have conciliatory relationships and relationships with countries other than a very distant superpower who's helping you fight everyone indefinitely. Because even if you compare Israel to Sparta, Sparta eventually ran up against the limits of fighting such a militaristic policy. And I don't think it's sustainable economically or politically for Israel in this case as well.
Love the comparison to Sparta. I was actually just about to ask about Egypt because my very basic understanding of their position in the past, sharing the only other land border with Gaza. Obviously, that border is closed now. I've been really curious, internally how Egypt's thinking on all of this has changed. Sharif, do you have insight into that?
Well, I think it's complicated. The Egyptian government for years has been a strong ally of Israel. It, for a decade and a half, helped enforce the blockade on Gaza. It closed the Rafah border at Israel's bidding, didn't allow Palestinians to cross. Once Abdel Fattah al-Sisi came into power in 2013, it then destroyed the tunnels that provided a lifeline to Gaza. It razed completely in an Israeli-style tactic. The Rafah is a border town. There's Egyptian Rafah and Rafah in Gaza, and they completely demolished the Egyptian Rafah to create a buffer zone. They've allowed the Israeli military to conduct drone strikes and aerial strikes in Sinai, where a low-level insurgency is taking place. And so they have completely been an ally to Israel in many ways. They often pay lip service to the Palestinian cause because the population is overwhelmingly in support of Palestine. But what we saw in the beginning of the onslaught on Gaza in October is that the Israelis had a very clear plan to push a lot of Palestinians, most of the Palestinians in Gaza, into northern Sinai. This is a long-standing colonial fantasy that dates back to the 1950s. And Egypt, for its own national security reasons, does not want a large restive refugee population in northern Gaza, which can then launch strikes back at Israel, as we saw in the past in Lebanon and Jordan. So, Sisi refused to open up the border to allow Palestinian refugees in unless aid was allowed in. This was met with a lot of support. And then what we've seen since then is that the Israelis crossed the Biden administration's so-called red line in May, invaded Rafah, took over the Philadelphia corridor, which is a 14-kilometer strip of land that borders between Egypt and Gaza. And now no one can get in or out, and Egypt has lost control of that border, which is part of the Camp David Treaty. And so there's a lot of bluster by the foreign ministry and others talking about how this, they might have to renegotiate their alliance with Israel and so forth. I don't think that there's going to be any serious change. I don't think Egypt will ever, send troops into Gaza. And it has shown that despite everything happening, it has continued to enforce Israeli policy on the border, even before they lost the Philadelphia corridor. They didn't have to abide by Israel's rules of allowing how many food trucks to go in and so forth, but they let Israel dictate the terms. And if we look at what happened in 2012, when Mohammed Morsi, a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, was briefly in power, there was a brief war, an assault on Gaza by Israel. And at the time, the Muslim Brotherhood, which has much closer ties to Hamas and was against the war, Mohammed Morsi sent in his prime minister, Hisham Andil, into Gaza with aid during the war in violation of Israel. And we saw that war stop within a week. So they don't have to. We do have precedents of where Egypt can dictate these terms. This is an Arab border between Palestine and Egypt, and it's allowing Israel to control it. And now they've lost control, and so it's in a difficult position. It keeps pleading to the United States to come up with some solution, but it hasn't been able to do so. But Egypt still is an important partner. You know, we saw these normalization deals happen in the last few years with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain, with other countries like Morocco and Sudan, which are much less robust. But the one with the UAE, which has become a real regional power, along with Saudi Arabia over the last 20 years, was seen as, you know, the model. And you really had real normalization with Israelis traveling to the UAE and partying in Dubai and cultural relations and so forth. But when 2021 happened and there was an actual conflict happening and missiles going back and forth, the UAE couldn't do anything as a broker. And it was actually Egypt that negotiated with Hamas and negotiated the ceasefire. It said, okay, look, we're going to have them stop rockets for a few hours at this time. And they managed to do it, and that paved the way for a proper ceasefire. So Egypt does have leverage and does have these long-standing relations, and the Egyptian intelligence does have connections to Hamas. So it's still an important player. But in terms of geopolitically changing its alliances, it still is a U.S. client state, and it won't do anything without their approval.
We only have a few moments left, but I do want to remind you that you can subscribe to our podcast feed, where we'll have all of our podcasts and audio reports that we're going to be producing at Dropsite News. Just go to wherever you get your podcasts, search for Dropsite News. You can also listen at dropsitenews.com. Now, in the time we have remaining, I just want to shift gears and talk about Pakistan for a moment and the coverage that Ryan and Murtaza have been doing. And I should say that soon after we launched Dropsite News and started publishing articles about Pakistan, the government banned us in that country, threatened us with litigation. I should also say that we've experienced censorship over our Gaza coverage from Meta on both Facebook and on Instagram. But Ryan, Murtaza, just briefly, let's talk about the reporting you've done on Pakistan, on democracy issues, on Imran Khan.
Well, you know, since the launch of Dropsite, we've been continuing coverage that myself and Ryan have been doing on Pakistan since the removal of Imran Khan. You know, it was a very eye-opening experience to cover this story because we came up against, you know, two simultaneous things. Number one, very, very unprecedentedly well-documented behind-the-scenes evidence of the way that the State Department and U.S. foreign policy functions behind the scenes in these conversations with foreign dignitaries and militaries and so forth, showing the pressure and the direct overbearing involvement in the democratic processes of Pakistan in this case, but presumably other countries in the region as well too. At the same time, you know, we reported this, we documented it in a very, very great detail. It made a huge impact in Pakistan. At the same time, we've seen such a blackout from American media about the subject. Very little interest, very little follow-up. Some New York Times reporters even weighing in to seemingly attack our reporting and implicitly defend the military, which is now ruling the country and this junta as it is. So it really impressed upon myself, and I'm sure Ryan and many others as well too, that how important our coverage was and continues to be. This is a country of 250 million people, has nuclear weapons, very strategically placed, a huge number of, you know, a very, very important large country, the sixth largest country in the world by population. There's almost no coverage of what's been going on there for the past year, which is basically a coup, more or less, against a democratically elected leader, a very popular democratically elected leader, involving the U.S. government, involving the military, and ongoing immiseration and subversion of democratic processes in that country, including torture and arrest and murders of political activists, reporters, and many, many others. So we're going to continue covering it. And most recently, myself and Ryan published a story, which should be of great interest to Americans too, showing that the Pakistani military, under duress, effectively, because of their poor economic situation, has been promised a major military naval base to the Chinese military that would give it access to the Arabian Sea and allow it to do potentially blockades on U.S. energy shipping in the midst of a war, and also escape potential U.S. Retaliatory actions in the South China Sea by having alternate ports for its own energy. It's a huge, huge, you could say, move of a chess piece if there's a rivalry between the U.S. and China, which allows China to really be on America's level. And this is all in the context of the U.S. State Department continuing to defend a Pakistani military regime, which is engaging in such vicious attacks on democracy, while quietly selling out America's strategic interests. It's a failed policy all along.
Yeah, and if you're anybody who cares about empire or foreign policy or world affairs, it's a really fascinating window to see all of that through. Even if you don't care directly about what's happening in Pakistan, although, as Maz said, it's a country of something like 230 million people with nuclear weapons. That's not a small thing. It's something like the fifth or sixth biggest country, in the entire world, which is shocking to think about given the blackout of coverage of it here in the United States, including the fact that we have how many 2 million or so Pakistani Americans here in the United States. It's a pretty large, well-educated, successful population. We kind of got into it by accident in a way. I remember a story kind of came across a transom where somebody was mentioning that there was a meeting in Islamabad where effectively the military called in the publishers and broadcasters of the newspapers and media outlets in the country and instructed them that you will not mention the name Imran Khan again. And of course, so nobody could cover that in Pakistan, but all you had to do was look at Pakistani media, and all of a sudden you noticed these shocking scrub outs of Imran Khan. You'd have a video, B-roll playing on what is essentially cable news of Imran Khan meeting with somebody else, and Imran Khan's face would be blurred out. They would sometimes just refer to him as the chairman of the PTI, his party, something like that. Like, just the most Orwellian and obvious kind of restriction on press freedom that you can imagine. And what makes Pakistan so interesting, to me in particular, is the way that all of the things that we fight about here are happening there, but at an exponentially more visible and obvious fashion. And so, if you care about those things, it's a way to see how a society is grappling with what would happen if you just unshackled all of the worst impulses of our system.
All right. On that note, we got to leave it there. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us here. And please do subscribe to Dropsite News. You can do that at dropsitenews.com. Today, I've been joined by Ryan Grimm, my colleague, Murtaza Hussain, Nausicaa Renner, and Sharif Abdel Kouddous. You can read all of our work, see all of our past work, and you can continue to follow the news along with our newsroom at dropsitenews.com. Deconstructed and Intercepted are a production of Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com. This program was brought to you in part by a grant from The Intercept. If you want to support our work, you can go to dropsitenews.com. This episode was produced by Jose Olivares. The theme music for Deconstructed is composed by Bart Warshaw. The theme music for Intercepted is composed by DJ Spooky. On behalf of everybody here at Dropsite News, thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time.